So I will talk about security and the concept of security in this small presentation. The concept of security is one of the most central concepts in political science and in international relations. First of all, security is an essentially contested concept. So this means that there is no one definition that researchers have agreed upon throughout all times. Barry Buzan, who's written a lot about the concept of security, put out a book called People, States and Fear back in the 1980s, where he was talking about security as an essentially contested concept. To be an essentially contested concept means both that there is, in this case with security, that there is academic debate about what the concept should be. There's also, if we look to political discussions of security, there's also political discussions over whether something should be a security issue if we look to it both historically, but also in contemporary politics. So climate change, for example, is a good example of a potential security problem where there are competing views over whether it should be a security issue or not. So if we look to the field of security studies, there is a sort of standard distinction between an objective conception of security, a subjective conception of security, and a discursive conception of security. If we're taking an objective conception of security, then security is defined as whether we can talk about there are objective, usually material threats, usually if we're talking about national security, to a state and its territory. If we're looking at the subjective conception of security, we're looking at to whether there is a fear that there are threats to a state and its territory. If we're looking to a discursive conception of security, then we're looking at the way in which particular issues are presented as security problems in language. The conception of security in terms of objective, subjective, and discursive is obviously relevant when we're talking about national security. But it's also relevant if we're talking about a broader conception of security. Within security studies, one talks about widening, deepening debates. So the widening component refers to whether security should be not just a military conception, but whether security should also be used to characterize threats, for example, in the economic sector, in the environmental sector, in terms of societal security, in terms of epidemic diseases, and in terms of, say, sexual violence in conflict zones. In terms of deepening, this refers to debates over whether one should not only look at security, the security of the state, but also look at security of individuals, of collective groups that don't correspond directly to the state, but also to global security. So you can also have people who are arguing in favor of conception of security that is primarily around individual security, because they're arguing that those that are actually most threatened are not states as such, but particular individuals. So in that sense, you can say you can have an objective conception of security that is also tied to the individual. So this means that security studies, if you're looking to the concept of security, actually is a very rich and varied field in terms of the different conceptions that are on offer. This means also there is not just one approach to security, and there's also not just one particular method through which security is studied. So in security studies, you have quantitative approaches that are looking at very large numbers of observations and are looking at to find causal mechanisms and causal relations between, for example, the ways in which states are governed and the likelihood of going to war. But you also have qualitative approaches, for example, in feminist security studies, looking at how lived experiences of security are significant to understanding both women's securities, but also the way in which that men might experience their insecurities, for example, as soldiers. one of the things that is important in terms of studying security, so in that sense you have to be aware of as a potential, say sort of limitation of the concept, is what it is that does not get to be constituted as security. So to perhaps make it a little bit more simple, to constitute something as a security issue is also to argue that this is an issue of a particular saliency and political urgency. So within what's called securitization theory or the Copenhagen school, the concept of securitization has been theorized to point to this dynamic that when something is constituted as a security issue, it is moved into a political logic of urgency and the need to do something fast. So this means also that those potential security problems that don't get to be constituted as security problems, well, yeah, I mean, it kind of goes without saying, they don't get to have the same, let's say, political attention as the questions that do get constituted. So that's also why it matters whether climate change, for example, gets to be constituted as a security issue or it doesn't get constituted as a security issue. So in that sense, it's having, when one does security studies, it is to always have both an analytical and a methodological attention to what is captured by this particular concept of security that I'm working with and what might not get captured. Given that security studies is one of the main subfields of international relations, there is a vast literature on security. There are classical texts by, for example, Arnold Wolfers, who wrote an article with the title National Security as an Ambiguous Symbol back in the early 1950s. You have a variety of textbooks and journals, the Journal of Security Studies, International Security, Security Dialogue, the relatively new journal of the International Studies Association called Journal of Global Security Studies. Those journals are good places to go to if one wants to get an up-to-date view of what's going on in security studies. I have written a book with Barry Buzan called The Evolution of International Security Studies. That book traces the concept of security and the formation of the field of security studies from the end of World War II and up until 2009. So if one is interested in the sort of more of the political background to the concept of security and to the sort of political and historical sociology of the field of security studies, that might be a book that would be of interest.